Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Sarah Turner, and I'm the guest artist manager here at Open Signal. This panel came about in response to Sabina Haque's exhibition, Annexation and Assimilation, Exploring the Archives East of 82nd Avenue, which is a project of the Portland City Archives and the Regional Arts and Culture Council. It's currently up in our lobby right now, so please feel free to take some time after the panel to explore it. And Open Signal is proud to present Sabina's exhibition on site to continue our commitment to regional storytelling on current climates and conditions that affect our understanding of and residents in Portland. And as you'll see in the film that we're about to watch and the exhibition, Portland has had a complicated history around creating policy, implementing plans, and allocating resources towards urban development and urban renewal. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, this is still a relevant issue, as just a little bit over a year ago, the City Council declared an emergency in housing and homelessness in Portland. Our city is rapidly gentrifying as we're heading into 2017, with urgent questions of how to provide for its current residents while opening avenues for new investment in our growing city. During this panel, we'll explore the questions when it comes to urban development, who has the power to direct investment, and whose voices shape those decisions. Are there sustainable models and successful projects that can inspire us to work within the current system of development or create our own? And we're very fortunate that this panel of experts can help uncover some of these questions, and I look forward to learning along with all of them from you guys. So now I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Sabina Haque, an internationally exhibiting artist who received her MFA at Boston University and now teaches fine art at Portland State University. Sabina exhibits her work throughout the States and internationally, connecting her personal experience of living between cultures and exploring the creative potential of the many places she calls home. Candice Kita, right there, is the Cultural Work and Development Coordinator at APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. She's an arts and culture worker committed to connecting people of color with creative opportunities. Weaving her creative background with her experiences in social justice, organizing, and nonprofit administration, Candice most recently co-founded Portland Emerging Arts Leaders Equity Committee. And then Joy Alise Davis studied at Parsons New School of Design and founded Design and Culture Lab, a research-driven urban social enterprise dedicated to the positive transformation of urban neighborhoods through collaborative design strategies that address the complex spatial issues associated with cultural, racial, and ethnic inequalities. She works to radically transform vulnerable communities through social sustainability, civic engagement, and inclusionary collaborative design strategies. And finally, we have Leslie Lum, who's a city planner and the North Portland District Liaison for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Her experience building and sustaining relationships with underserved and underrepresented communities throughout the city is an asset to the North Portland community. And since the late 1990s, Leslie has worked alongside many communities and neighborhoods, including what is now New Columbia. So thank you, panelists, for being here to talk about your work and help us unpack these very large issues affecting our city right now. And first, we'll watch Sabina's film, Annexation, How East Portland Was Born, and then the panel will jump into discussion. At around 8 o'clock, we'll open up the questions to the audience so you guys can participate in the discussion as well. So Sabina, would you like to introduce the film and give a little bit more context about what we're about to see?
Sure. Just a few sort of tidbits. The project was centered around being the residence artist in the city archives, and it was a really amazing process of sort of surrounding myself with this history of how East Portland became part of the city, because the city has only documents starting from the 1980s, because before that there was no documentation in the official record. So how do you document something that's been undocumented? And this part of the land that we see historically was Native American, and then had Japanese farmers on it that were then interned, and so it's almost like an excavation site where years and years and years of different communities have lived east of 82nd, and it's sort of a psychological barrier in our minds now. Even a lot of us think that the boundary of the city of Portland is actually 82nd, but it's not. It goes all the way out, to Gresham. So this is actually all the images that you see. The text is actually documents from the archives that are animated. So some of the stuff you're going to see, like, really? Does that actually happen? I'm like, yeah, this is all from the archives. And then the interviews are from residents from East Portland, including an 80-year-old woman who can't come to the events because she's not mobile, but she's very much alive and kicking. And her interview is around what happened in the 80s and how she led a movement to create another city, which never happened. But it's all in 7 minutes, so let's start.
I think what you're seeing in the 80s is a result of the agreement with Multnomah County leaders, elected leaders, City of Portland leaders, to have us annexed. It was done as an intergovernmental agreement. Intergovernmental agreements mean that two elected leaders can sit in their room at that point and write the agreement, and there's no public process. There were this group of people out there that appeared to be $7.50 each coming into the city of Portland. So it was like a giant grant program for the city of Portland.
In 1986, East County has its municipal services cut. Police, park, and planning services are no longer under the jurisdiction of Multnomah County.
I have studied the situation and determined that the only way for East County to receive necessary urban services is through joining the City of Portland.
But I think by that time, a lot of people living in this area could see change was going to happen. And the question is, did they want it done to them, or did they want to participate in it? But whether or not it did, we thought it was appropriate that people have a chance to vote, which did not happen with annexation.
We've never had any government, elected or appointed, who had any desire to protect the interests of the citizens of Mid-County.
Talk about transparency. There was none around the annexation effort, ever. It was never transparent. It was generally, here's what we're going to do.
Housing developers in the 1960s were not required to connect to Portland sewers. They simply drilled down and created septic tanks for these new stretches of suburban homes. It was a building trend that had dramatic consequences decades later.
Kim Pearsall is a recently divorced mother who makes $20,000 a year. She has 2 young children and is expecting a 3rd child in December. She receives minimal child support. Her childcare alone costs over $400 a month. Her friends help her pay for her groceries. She does not qualify for the full safety net. She will likely lose her home. How do you tell her sewers are affordable?
After annexation, 56,000 homeowners are required to hook up to Portland's sewer system. Because the ballot measure to fund sewers failed, the average cost to fund sewer lines per household was between $5,000 and $9,000. Total costs ran upwards of $255 million, mostly paid by East County residents.
It was a complex primarily filled with just refugees from the Vietnam War, a lot of, Hmong families as well as Lao families, Mien, Vietnamese, there was just a large population of us around there, and it was really fun to be kind of in a place. I remember as a kid, just being able to play with all of the neighbors and their kids, and we would just have so much fun. The little dirt patch right next to the apartment complex. He worked really hard to support us. At one time, he had 2 full-time jobs, from 8 until 5, and then he'd work like a swing shift from like 6 until, midnight or 1. Initially, all of her family was here in Portland, but they all started moving down to California because the benefits were better. It's really hard to see how Portland has changed because of the gentrification rate. I mean, there used to be like a Black community here, and Alberta was starting to get gentrified. Driving down those streets, I mean, it's really hard for me to drive down those streets because I used to live right down on Killingsworth, Alberta, Mississippi, all of those streets. And so it's really different, and there's no Black community. I mean, there are some families there still, but it's less and less and less. My work right now, we are working on that because 82nd is like a really big hub for a lot of Asian-owned businesses and Asian families. Their rents are rising. We were already kind of pushed out far, and now the thought of even being pushed out further, that's pretty scary.
The Jade District, although the name implies a very Asian American identity, is comprehensive of many different ethnic backgrounds.
The Jade District is part of a new system of urban revitalization spearheaded by the Portland Development Commission. The Jade is one of 8 districts around Portland that will receive capacity building support and funding, around $1 million over the next 10 years. Community organizations are working with Metro to build affordable housing and a community space on the corner of 82nd and Division.
Panos is hoping to be a part of that process and really being a voice at the table. The last thing that we want to see is our communities being pushed out.
I think there's enough groups and communities of color talking about this and bringing it up to, the mayor, county commissioners, the Portland Housing Bureau, things like that. I just want to see traction and to see those changes.
Thank you so much, Sabina, for sharing that with us. So after watching that film, I'm really curious, what has the annexation of East Portland in terms of city planning and policy taught us?
So, we can all sort of answer this from our own perspective, but one of the things that I found throughout, and I think you're going to see it in the film, was the lack of voice from the community. And so how that's changed or evolved through city planning, and I'd like to hear your perspective as well on that. How do we really engage with the community, and how do we work with development or change sort of from a bottom instead of the top-down model? And the other thing is sort of this broken promises. What is that role between the city and the community and even the developers? Because you can see in the film, the developers basically benefited hugely from going out there in the 1950s, 60s. I mean, Fred Myers was out there and he did his first ever giant gateway because he didn't want to deal with Portland, a city of Portland regulations. So he went out to unincorporated at the time county to establish his. So a lot of people were out there doing what they wanted to do, and later on, that came back to haunt us with 56,000 households requiring sewer hookups and people having to pay when they couldn't really afford to pay. And so that's a question also that I often ask myself is like, what is the role of the city with the community, and who are the different stakeholders, and who are the different intermediaries? So just open that up to you guys.
So I guess I'll go next. So, you know, I can't speak for the city in that I'm one person, but I can talk from my experience and, you know, how I think things should operate. So I think this is a complicated question to answer, and I think that fundamentally, I think it's you know, what is planning? How do you do planning? And that's kind of the approach that I take to everything. It's sort of a philosophical question of a framework of how you operate. And I think that, you know, what you speak to is exactly the issue. And, you know, we see this, you know, you talked about east, you talked about north, northeast, and you're, you know, talking about change and displacement, basically. Well, you talked about that in northeast, and Janice talked about that in the film. So I think that, you know, how I approach it in terms of planning, I really approach it in terms of, I really have an equity lens in terms of looking at things from justice. And actually, just the other day, I was doing a little research, and I'm not trained as a planner, I'm trained as an architect, and most of my work that I've done throughout my life has been around working on housing community development and working with homeless families. But I was looking at what is it called, Code of Conduct for Planners, and actually in it, it was crafted, some of it was crafted during the civil rights era. So it specifically says that we're supposed to plan for, you know, everyone in general, but specifically we're supposed to look at marginalized communities, underserved communities, communities that don't have a voice, and bring that to the table. So it's really justice oriented. And it was, you know, that's really interesting thinking about that now when you think of, you know, what's happened in planning overall and how there's all these unintended consequences that happened over time. Unintended and, you know, some would say intended, it just depends, you know, it varies. So I think that, so for me, I really believe that planning should be community based. So everything planned should, you know, come up from the ground, and then, you know, we all work together to create a plan for the community. So I know that that's a really general way of talking about it, but I can only be more specific if we, you know, hopefully if people ask specific questions, then I can talk about what that means.
I mean, yeah, I resonate a lot with that as well. And this question makes me think about, you know, how can people really participate in the design of their neighborhood in the truest sense, right? When you look at how East Portland kind of became East Portland, it was just kind of the line was moved, right, by the city to include more taxpayers. And a lot of that approach is, like Sabina mentioned, really top down. And it's the city kind of defining spaces for residents as opposed to residents kind of defining spaces for themselves. And kind of how it impacts or intersects with Panos' work. The film mentions the Jade District, and that's a neighborhood prosperity initiative district. And I'm not sure if, you know, residents of the Jade District necessarily see themselves as that being their primary identity, because it's kind of a moniker that has been applied to this particular area in order to spur economic development. But what does that really mean for the residents of that particular area? And how do people relate to this idea of being a Jade District resident? What is the psychology in being kind of folded into a neighborhood that has been defined for you? And I think that's kind of a larger question as well.
I definitely agree with both of you. What I found interesting, even about this question, is I feel like this is a constant practice, and this is something that we're constantly learning and prototyping and trying to find the best way to reach this group. And I think Portland does, on the books, have a great program where they do reach out. But it's really about how those voices are being leveraged and how they're being utilized. And it's one thing to host a town hall meeting and take notes and then leave the notes at the office afterwards. But what I've learned from this film, and also just working in East Portland, is just the power of making sure those voices are leveraged properly, and that you're documenting it and you're coming back to it later, and you're reviewing it, and it's not something you do a one and done situation. What I love about this city is that it's still at a good size where you can really rely on relationship building. You can really go and talk to people directly, and it's not so large like in New York City or any other metropolitan city. And I think from this experience, we learned just how to leverage voices and how to do that effectively.
Thank you, guys. So it sounds like speaking to community members is really important part of your practice. Can you talk about who your communities are and how you engage with them?
Well, I can talk specifically about this project and kind of being a creative artist and working with community. I grew up in Pakistan, so my community has shifted over time, and I did a project in East Portland with the Somali community before I went into the archives and sort of further investigated how, East Portland came into being. And when I started working with the archives, I was like, where are these people? I need to find them, right? So I'm looking at these documents and engaging with the community, which led me to the people that you saw in the film. Then I sort of partnered with the Pano. I partnered with the East Portland Neighborhood Association, the East Portland Action Plan. And through that, I sort of started to see how my role as an artist can be a mediator for bringing these communities together in a creative way. Placekeeping is a word that's been thrown around. How do we actually do that with community? How do we facilitate the artist, the community maker, the nonprofit, the housing agency, the city? So I see my role as kind of being that mediator between the two and sort of working on projects that way.
So in terms of who my community is, so personally, I identify as Chinese American, Asian American, and I think that I spend some volunteer time working with the Jade and working on issues with them and trying to kind of really talk about self-determination, because I really think that this is what it's all about, is, really, again, getting to the values of, what do each one of us, what do we all value, and how do we get to what we value and what we want to see happen in the world around us, and how do we shape it, and how do we make it happen. In terms of work, placekeeping is an interesting word to me, in that when I got out of school, I actually was doing urban design. And I think urban design is a wonderful tool to engage people. It's a really, to help, you can illustrate things. It's a really participatory thing. But I think that this whole thing about what placemaking means is a big part to me about what urban design is too. And and my personal experience, I found that oftentimes when placekeeping efforts or placemaking efforts occur, oftentimes what ends up happening is erasure ends up happening of a community that's there. So I think, I no longer work in urban design, partly because I really need to do work that's a little bit more topical, and things work in issues that are much more immediate. And I think that's probably why I'm here tonight too, is because this is a really important topic. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure if I.
It's good.
Leslie, like how you divided or you talked about both your kind of personal communities as well as your professional communities, because it's kind of an interesting question to address, how one relates to that. And I mean, personally, I'm fourth generation Japanese American, mixed race, English speaking, and I live in Southeast Portland, and I work at Apano, which is near 82nd Division, and that area is predominantly low income, 55% people of color, huge refugee and immigrant population, a number of languages spoken, ranging from Vietnamese and other Asian languages to Russian and Spanish. And
67 languages
67 languages
in the David Douglas School District.
Thank you for that. That stat, Sabina. I didn't have that one in my back pocket. But it's hugely diverse. And for me, it's also sometimes a challenge, in kind of intersecting my own personal communities with the communities I work with, because I don't necessarily identify with all of those, but in what ways can I also help facilitate placekeeping, right, and really focus on empowering residents to be first in having their voices heard in spaces in which decisions about their neighborhood are made. So navigating that is can be a challenge, but I think it's a worthy one too.
I want to first say how exciting and empowering it is to be on this panel with women of color. It's very, very rare, I think, that I find myself on a whole panel where we can just be ourselves and talk about things and lead with what racial identity we have first. Sometimes it kind of feels like it's seen as a burden than something to celebrate and something that actually helps you do your work better. I like mentioned before, I have a public involvement racial equity firm. My team were all women, all of color, planner and urban design background. And as a person who identifies as a daughter of the African diaspora and all that encompasses, I find that in Portland there's this really exciting, it's not necessarily new, but this coalition of people of color, and that's primarily the community that I work within. And like you mentioned, it's challenging, especially identifying within personally a small portion of that, but wanting to relate to a larger narrative. I think that it's really easy to lump us all together and assume that we have shared ideas, and the reality is that we're very, very diverse. And it's going to take a lot of attention and collaborative design strategies and new ways of thinking to get us to come together, but we're powerful. Like you said, 61 languages, and I heard a little rumor that very soon it's going to be majority of color in Portland. I say very, very soon, in a couple of years, probably like 20 years, but something exciting. I really think that as a city has practiced this idea of right to shape your own city. We saw that in the 80s, in this fight to really be a part of designing and being a part of this urban planning and this really rich history of social justice. And I think as we move forward, it's really going to be about how we could do that within difference, and how we recognize that we have multiple identities and there's privilege along with that, and that no one is free from privilege. And yeah, I know that's a long answer to a very short question, but that's the community that I operate in.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And I'm hoping that we can dive a little bit deeper maybe into specific projects that you all have worked on that kind of incorporate the work that you're talking about now.
Sure. Through this project, I work specifically with Harrison Park School, which again is very, very diverse. And I collaborated with another wonderful organization headed by Tamara Lynn, called Living Stages, and they do work with theater, and it's sort of a very sort of non-traditional theater. She would describe it better, but we did a image shadow theater play with these 4th or 5th graders, and it was called Belonging, and it was really exploring. I mean, in the classroom itself, we had kids from all over, from southern cities like Alabama, and she was like, I speak Alabama. She was so cute. And so it was really interesting to have like all the children share their backgrounds and what does it mean to really belong and kind of connect, and also the pain of not belonging. So they did these beautiful kind of sets which were very humanistic in sense of like how we create social dynamics where we're tearing communities apart or we're putting people together just within, their ecology of the classroom, and even between genders. And so there was 5 skits, and we performed it at the installation of the show, which was held at Apano in their community space, which is on the corner of 82nd and Division, which is one of the most high trafficked intersections in Portland. But one of the issues that I think continues to be is how do we sort of elevate these voices to a larger level? How do we get these narratives out to the community and to the mainstream? That becomes part of like what I'm trying to figure out is like, I can do another project with Madison High School and we can make a zine and we can project it on buildings. How do we get it to City Hall? How do we get it to different neighborhoods? How do we get it into Pioneer Square? So how do we elevate these alternative visions for our community, which aren't getting the limelight? Because at the end of the day, money, developers, it has to pencil out. These are all the things that are defining our city at the moment, and these smaller narratives sometimes get lost. So that's my sort of what I'm thinking about as an artist.
So let's see, what projects do I do? So I'll explain what I do with the city first. So I'm something called a district planner or district liaison, and we have 5 or 6 or 7 if you count Central City. But there's like a north, northeast, southeast, west, and east planner. And so I feel really lucky to have the job that I have. You know, we have like environmental planners, we have economic planners, we have different kinds of planners. So I'm lucky in that I get to, people can call me, you know, north or anywhere in the city or anywhere out of the country, I guess. You can call me and ask me whatever question you want. You can call and ask about what your zoning is. You can call about garbage, and I'll refer you who you need to go to if you're having garbage problems. Or you can, you can talk about, most of the questions are really specific about, I want to change my zoning because we've been working on this 20-year plan that's doing that and other things. But so I'm really fortunate in that I have a lot of contact with the public, as much as they want, basically. And I have been waiting. I've been in this position for 3 years, and I've been waiting and waiting till, people in North, which covers from Piedmont and then Overlook and up Bridgeton, Hayden Island, all the way over to St. John's, Cathedral Park, and then hops over to Linton. So like 11 or 12 neighborhoods. And I've been waiting for people one neighborhood to like really talk about displacement or gentrification. And St. John's has been really consistent about that from the start. And so I'm really lucky in that, I've been sticking around and trying to, get them resources and ready to, help them with that conversation and pull everything together to have that conversation. So it's been really exciting. So now we're at that stage where we can have that conversation and we can figure out, maybe what a community plan looks like or how they want to proceed. And so what I do is and the history there in St. John's is that, up along Fessenden, there used to be black community. There's not really that many black renters left. And you have Latino communities now, and they've had to face, one apartment complex in particular had to pay 72 families. I think they got no cause evictions. And so anyway, we're trying to mobilize around that issue with the Community Alliance of Tenants and other groups that are around there. So I'm really lucky in that I feel like, this is something that is dear to my heart, and I get to actually work on it and work with the community on it. I won't talk anymore, so keep going.
I'll speak to 2 of Panos' projects that intersect kind of with this conversation. The first is the development at 82nd Division, which you saw a sneak peek of in Sabina's video. But we're currently fundraising to make that space a reality. And we're scheduled to tear down the existing old furniture store, if you've been there, at the end of this year. And it's going to be redeveloped into a first floor of Apano offices and a brand new community space, and then 3 floors of affordable housing on top with 48 units. And we're working with Rose CDC on this particular project. And that's a really tangible, infrastructure improvement for the Jade District, in that it's the 3rd busiest intersection for public transit in the city, and an area that's being rapidly gentrified. If you've gone down Division in the past, 3 years, you've seen it change pretty immensely. So that's been a huge project for us to really resist gentrification and displacement and provide additional assets and resources for the community. And secondly, on the more creative front, I work pretty closely with Sabina on a placemaking program that Apano runs. And it's been growing over the past 3 years or so. We've had 3 cohorts of placemaking artists kind of reside with Apano, and they really embark on community-based, place-based projects in East Portland. And kind of the unique, I think, factor within our placemaking work is that it is also really anti-displacement and anti-gentrification focused, which I think provides an interesting facet to it, just because there is so much conversation about, well, what happens when artists kind of work in the community, and is that a pathway to gentrification? And we don't see it as that. We see it as a way to kind of help folks even more strongly connect with their own neighbors and with their community, and really illuminate how the communities already have valuable assets, right? To work with. We don't need to bring in new things. And we're really intentional in how we select our artists to participate. And they're all deeply, deeply connected, whether residents or have been working in the community for years, to participate in this particular program. And one thing that came out of the program as well, which I brought as just a little visual aid, but last year we developed an art plan for the Jade and Midway districts that talks about kind of our vision for what community placemaking looks like in these neighborhoods, given their unique contexts. And it talks about different kind of like placemaking strategies, whether that's like festivals or poetry slams or anything else kind of creative you can imagine. But it is really a people and East Portland driven vision for what placemaking can look like. And if you're interested in like learning more about this particular plan, you can also find it online on the Apana website under our cultural work section. So I'll leave it at that.
Projects. So we primarily work a range of projects, a lot of public space to transportation to housing. As long as it has a core mission of using identity and that intersection between identity and place, which I think is a core of a placemaking approach and methodology, we really want to be involved in it. Two projects I'm thinking in particular. One was the PAL Division Transit and Development Project. This is this big rapid bus transit system that is supposed to connect Portland to Gresham. This was a great collaborative effort. I believe it was one of our first projects in Portland. We worked with the renowned Kogan Owens and Green and this great firm, the Multicultural Collaborative. And this idea was that we were engaging using a range of strategies, get people more involved in helping deciding, ranging from what the development's going to look around it. So ideas, if you want certain economic development ideas around different businesses or affordable housing, but also designing some of the actual the transit stops, as well as trying to decide where those transit stops were going. Through that project, what I really loved about it, like I mentioned a little bit before, is that the range of strategies. It was everything from stakeholder committees to focus groups to fun activities where we're actually playing together and building our ideal bus stop and using that as data. A big part of what we do is mediation, like you mentioned before, but also translating complicated city planning and urban design language into everyday language and vice versa. Even though I'm not a planner, I'm an urban designer by trade, it's difficult when you go to a meeting and they talk with the PowerPoints and really, really hardcore urban planning language, and the average person has no idea how to navigate that space. So we try to help and alleviate that pain point, that stress. Another great project is also one of the first that I did when I moved here, was the POLF People's Plan. This is a nonprofit, the Portland African American Leadership Forum. They've been around for a few years, primarily convening African Americans around place, about what it means to be Black in Portland, around housing, economic development, and numerous of other subcommittees. And this project in particular, we were tasked with creating a plan, a people's plan for Black Portland, and that can mean anything. But what I was excited about is that we had an open slate. Typically, we get hired for a certain project. We're only doing public space. We're only doing transportation. And a lot of the times people, like naturally, we want to talk about everything. Everything relates. We can't just talk about housing without talking about economic development, or vice versa, and then we have displacement. We can't talk about park design without health, without how that affects housing, and everything is really connected. This project, we did a year of engagement, hundreds of people, which sounds easy, but the fact that was mentioned up there about how displacement works and how everything is really fragmented. This population has been completely fragmented in Portland, where there was a neighborhood and now there's no neighborhood. So engaging, getting people excited to think a little bit more proactive and not reactionary, and get involved in decision making before something like that happens, is typically not what happens in this community group. So what was exciting was to start from scratch, to have this open, collaborative conversation about what a Black utopia would look like. Because Portland is supposed to be this utopia. That was what it was created for, but it wasn't created for everyone. So that's been a really great effort through POLF. It comes out, I want to say, in a month or two. I'm hoping earlier than a month or two, but let's just say 2 months to be safe. But this was a 2-year-long effort. that I'm really excited to come out.
That's great. Thank you, guys. I just wanted to pause for a second and ask if you all wanted to ask each other questions, if there's anything that has sprung up in the conversation so far.
Putting us on the spot.
Like that wasn't on the list.
You know, I think that what you're talking about is at the core of this dialogue about how do we change this top-down model, and really how do we sort of fight against that in a way and elevate these different approaches. And that's what's really important. I talked with a colleague of mine at Portland State, Lisa Bates, and she was like, it's really important to really kind of reinvent it. We don't have to just take these pieces of old development or old policies. It's really about creating new policies that are grounded in the community, that are grounded in creativity. It's really about creating this new space. And all of us have to do that together. And I'm just wondering, like, what do we see towards the future, and what are the strategies? Because I feel sometimes, you know, and it was really empowering for Lisa to say that, you know what, you artists, you guys are important because you guys are going to use that imagination to catapult you to the next space, to the next city. And that's what's really important, the power of that imagination and how to like harness it to take us to that new level. And that's where I'm sort of thinking about, we can't do it alone. Like I'm thinking maybe we need the East Portland art brigade, or we need before I had my team, you have your team, but we need something bigger, right? And then we need to have these collaborations because it can't just be East Portland, it has to be East and Northeast Portland. So it's sort of like these loose collaboratives where we're all kind of talking together like we are today, but we rarely in this individualized society where we have all been displaced just by the nature of the communities that we have created in 2017, you know. So that's sort of the big question, is like, how do we come together more often? How do we elevate the imagination to create these new structures that are yet to be actually in place? Yeah, that's my question for us.
Well, I think something you also kind of hit on, Sabina, in the role of like artists within this work too, is, you know, how can you make community and neighborhood design fun and something that feels like you can be a part of?
Exactly.
You know, when you see kind of a flyer for the next, you know, town hall, does that inspire you to go, or would you rather see, you know, a dance performance at a bus stop, you know,
right.
That really makes you think about your relationship to this place and what you expect from it? So I think there's a certain magic that art can bring in this conversation and really fold people in new ways that might not be kind of the most traditional, right? But I think that's kind of part of the creative thinking and visioning that we want to do to make these processes more accessible for folks. Because, you know, going to a town hall can be really intimidating if it's, you know, your first time and you don't feel part of the political process. And that's kind of where decision making starts. So how can you open that door wider for folks and really provide a forum that could be enjoyable and interesting and make you feel like you belong?
Yeah, like, you know, working with high school students who may feel totally disenfranchised, and then you go in and be like, you know, what would you like to see in your neighborhood? What would you like to see changed? Now let's work on drawing it. Let's work on silkscreening it. Let's make posters. Let's project it into buildings. Let's hand out these zines to different people. So all of a sudden you've sort of like asked them that question, and then you've kind of found ways to engage and then to actually empower and then to actually spread the message. And so like this kind of very simple process, but it kind of starts to escalate.
Yeah, I actually want to say something about that. And I think that the most important thing, I think, is to ensure that I think the People's Plan is a perfect example, or, you know, the work happening at the Jade, and that it's, you know, it's coming from a place, or it's coming from a people, and they're the ones who are creating this plan. And, you know, it's great to have artists and other people there, but the essential thing is to recognize, you know, who is at the table, who needs to be at the table, who's creating this plan. And, you know, in this case, it's, you know, it's African Americans, and it's people who many people who used to live in a particular part of town who are dispersed now. So it's like, having conversations then about place. Is place like a physical thing? Is it a theoretical thing? Is it a spiritual or emotional thing? But, well, whatever the case is, the point is just that, I think it needs to start from the bottom and then it works its way to the top. So, if you have an idea or if you are you have a goal of some sort, you create the space that you need with your people, whoever your people are, to create it, and and make sure that voices that are not at the table, who don't have access, are there, and you all create a plan together, and then then you reach out to other folks. And working in the government, I actually tell people to hold me accountable. Who pays me? Taxpayers pay me. Exactly. So it's really, when you think of government and all these institutions, who are we accountable to? There are many different interests out there, and, when I think of my role now that I'm a middle class person, I have an obligation even more so to ensure that people who have less than me, class wise, that I'm trying to, serve them. And that's who I think I should be working the most for, to ensure that now that I have something, I'm obligated to do so much more to ensure that everybody has a piece of, something.
It has me thinking a lot about placemaking as nerdy moment, just in terms of how it's taught and how it's talked about. And that's why I love so much your program, is that it kind of breaks down this myth that it has to be, a white suburban neighborhood doing placemaking. That's typically how people talk about it and how it's celebrated, and how, in doing it in this context and it's reappropriating or taking that name and making it useful and beneficial to all people, I think is so, so important, because we can get really stuck in a bunch of buzzwords and a bunch of, equity is one of them right now, or whether it's sustainability, and I'm guilty of it too. Like, all these words, like, what does it actually mean and how is it leveraged appropriately? And I think that project in particular, I'm so excited about. I hope it never ends. No, I really do. I hope it continues to grow, and that it really grounds in it. And what I love too is that's not shying away from those tough conversations around displacement, around inequality, and it's not just let's just paint something and call it a day, but it's like intentional, and that's the work you do too. It's intentional art. It's not using it as a way to
beautify.
As a PR. It's really about getting people involved and bringing that up in from a graphic
elevating
perspective.
those narratives. Yeah.
Can I say one more thing really quick? So I think that and this whole thing, the value of the work that you're doing with Midway and then with the Jade, is that people look at 122nd, people look at Division, people look at 82nd, and throughout time, people are always like, that's a wasteland. Car dealerships, I don't know what else people see when they go out there, but and people want to erase what they see and don't see value in it. And this is the whole thing about place is place a people. Why is place valued so much more than people? And the conversation always is about physical things and improving it so it looks better, beautification projects. But what's actually happening is that if you look, whether you go to Portland, whether you go to like 23rd, or maybe not 23rd, but if you go to Division, or you go to Manhattan, or you go to Seattle, or you go to LA, or you go to Florida, every single place is starting to look the same. So what makes it different? We're redeveloping places so quickly, and we have to ensure that we are retaining what's left. But we really have to find the beauty of what's currently there. 82nd to me is beautiful. Those car lots, there's a reason why they're there. They've been there for a long time, and we need to actually be supporting them. How can we support them so we can work with them more, so they're more reflective of whatever the needs of people have around there. But I feel like it's so disrespectful the way people have talked about and treated 122nd, all these places in East Portland, as if it's blight, as if it's just...
Well, and that's happened, as you said, in the African American community on Williams and all those neighborhoods, that design week, which we're in currently, that aesthetic. And that is, that is an aesthetic that we need to sort of, wonder about. That being said, I was going to sort of I was thinking about this notion of placekeeping And again, the role of the city and how do we get things done on a larger scale? How do we all collaborate together? And I was looking for models in the US, and then I was like, none there. Moving on to, and Europe and Berlin, right, comes up. And so they have this interesting problem, right, because they were divided and then they came together. And so there's like uneven development. And Berlin is like, the city is now the people. And that's what I'm thinking, is that our communities have to really elevate themselves and really come together to kind of put the responsibility back and have that really sort of one-to-one dialogue with the city, which is what Berlin is now encountering. There's this huge group of community members that is working with the city on different plans around how they want to see it develop. It's not perfect, but they sure are doing a lot more, because I think in that community, they really consider themselves as, we're the authority here. You're servicing us. That's your role here. It's not about, and so there's this dynamic that we, as facilitators, as community builders, to really raise that public to kind of confront that model that's still very much present. And Oregon Humanities just did a thing where there was 4 developers, and they all said, if it doesn't pencil out, we aren't doing it. And so that's what we're against. We need to think about how to resist that together.
Great, thank you guys. So it's about 8 o'clock, so I'm going to open up questions to the audience now. Do you all have any questions you'd like to ask the panel?
Yeah.
So you used the word nerdy for a second there. And then I'm going to go to the mic.
You want to give her the mic? Yeah.
I think, is this on?
Yeah, just
Okay.
hold it close.
I think a lot of the power in the questions and in how community can really engage it goes to this nerdy place of the policies, right? Like there's zoning policies, there's, until just this year, Oregon was one of the few places that did not allow inclusionary zoning. So I guess one of my questions is, how do we work in communities and with communities in creative ways to not only bridge this, like, what do you want to see, but the piece of how do we get it done?
Right. How do we get sidewalks?
Like, how do we get sidewalks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, how do we get sidewalks? How do we get, how do we go from in East Portland, there are a lot of areas that have kind of food deserts, I would say, where you have to drive for half an hour. And I graduated from Park Rose High School, so I think I can.
So, I can talk a little bit about the research and kind of so one of the things around sidewalks, infrastructure, things that you saw, sewers, literally, like, this is what the city officials in 1981 concluded, that annexation would require developing 10 neighborhood parks and 4 large community parks, and $7 million was the cost. And they basically said, well, that is prohibitive. And so they said, we'll just schedule it over the next 20 years. I think the problem with specifically underserved communities, communities of color, low-income communities, is, again, the loudest people, you said this, they will fight, right? At the same time, Southwest Portland, Charlie Hales at that time said to the city, we're going to put in East Portland 14,000 new units. So they shoved in all these units, literally like developments where there was a house on a giant lot, on a flag lot. There's a gravel road that you turn into, and then you drive all the way down to a development that has like all these buildings, right? And in 2013, a 5-year-old dies because there's no sidewalk and there's no road and there's no place. So it's at that point, I think it's really about organizing. And we're starting to do that. We're just starting to do that around, like you said, people of color, people of low income, trying to organize around that and to really put pressure, because On the other side, Southwest, in 1980, they had a plan that they were forcing down their throat, the city, and they fought back tooth and nail, and they said, we don't want 6,000 new units crammed into our community. And they didn't get it. So, it's also about affluence. And as community, Pano is doing a great job. So there has to be somebody who's speaking up for the little guy, right? I mean, food deserts, Marcato, right? Great solution to, it's one solution to the problem of Fubon has been around, but there are solutions out there that can be community driven. But it does need people who are going to support. Yeah, that's what I see.
I would add that I agree. I think that it needs multiple entry points, and it can't just be. Let me back up. It's to pass policy or to make systematic changes. You're going to need from the ground up. You need that grassroots level. But you're also going to need allies inside. It's so crucial to help you navigate the system in a sense. I'm a big fan. Long-term strategies is we need more low-income people of color in planning, going to school and getting those degrees and being a part of the inside. My uncle was a planner, and when I asked him why he did, he said, well, I was a social justice guy, and I wanted to make change, and this was the way I learned how to do it. And even that, that's loaded in itself. There's a lot of problems within how urban planning is taught, but I would say we need more people on the inside as well as fighting from the ground up. And we're going to need both to be successful. We're going to need to be thinking about long-term and short-term strategies at the exact same time. It's going to need collaboration, like you mentioned, and coordination.
Exactly. And the city plan finally has now where they have a quota system almost, where they're going to be hiring people of color, and they're putting that on the forefront now in their plan to have people who are city employees actually be people of color. Because you said, that you're one of the only people of color in your area, or one of the few people, or the only. I don't know.
I'm not the only. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you brought up the issue of power, and I think that this is a lot of what the conversation that we have in front of us is. All this whole conversation is about power, basically. And these are all really kind of complicated questions with lots of, we could probably go talk all night. But so I think that there's so many. Okay, so I think that one thing in this day and age that we're in right now, I think it's really incumbent upon each one of us to really to really look at the world around us in terms of what we want to see, live what we want to see, that sort of thing, and think about what our role is. Like, again, as a middle-class person, I don't need to be speaking for other people, and I don't need to be making a plan for other people, hopefully, but what I should be doing is finding those people and, and giving them information that they need and assisting them to create their own plan or whatever it is that they want to do. But each one of us has to understand what our role is. We all have a role in terms of privilege and power, and recognizing what power and privilege we have in order to, support people to do what they need to do. And then putting aside, I need to put aside the fact that I want to park in front of my house. When people are in front of my house, I get really pissed off, but then I'm like, I don't own the street. Why do, I have a car. Other people don't have a car. Why am I pissed off that people at the laundromat are parked in front of my house? So it's like putting aside my own issue and, giving what I have and supporting other people to help raise, their voices. That's one thing. I don't, and
That's a good one. I wanted to snap almost, but I didn't.
So, I'm a cog in the machine of a government, but it really needs to come from the ground, and I don't know what else to say. I could go on and on, but I'm going to stop. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Did you have a more specific question? Please ask if you have a more specific question.
Well, somebody else.
Okay, but I bet I don't know if she got her question answered. Okay.
We'll follow up.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. The question I'm asking is from a couple of different perspectives all rolled into one. On the one hand, I want to ask, what do you not like about town halls? And I'm not saying that because I like town halls. I want you to articulate that. And on the other hand, I'm looking at slavery. Like when you go to New Orleans, you can go to Congo Square and think about what that was like when slaves were on the auction blocks. And it's just vacant now. It's a desert. But what do we do with the auction block that is still 82nd Avenue for sex trade and slavery? And how can we help to organize or not be in the way of organizing houseless citizens in the town to get out of the way so that they can exist with us at the same time?
Who talked about the town hall?
I think I mentioned it.
I mentioned town halls too. That's a really good question about what you don't like about town halls, because I feel like it's such a mixed bag of. I very much appreciate this idea of people being able to come to a place, gather together, and talk about issues that concern them. At the same time, I also recognize, or I view town halls as being culturally specific, and that they usually don't kind of operate in different ways of interacting and being. So thinking about like what languages are they in, or do all community members like to kind of participate in this particular way? Do people feel like they already have a voice? Are people comfortable speaking? Is it more effective to organize around your kitchen table first and then have a representative speak at your town hall, right? I think acknowledging that town halls operate under very specific paradigms and conditions that don't necessarily work for everyone is probably the biggest, my biggest beef with town halls on that particular subject.
I'll snap to that. I feel the exact same way. I think I would just add that it feels like town halls are very much of a one-sided conversation for me. I'm more of a fan of, and I'm not saying that we should get rid of town halls. For a lot of people, that works perfectly well, and they can navigate that system. But I think it's one of those things we need to add that to another list of strategies that work for a lot of other people. But the one-sided conversation, the PowerPoint, the let me talk for 30 minutes and then give you 20 minutes to ask questions, I'm not so much a fan of that. I would rather have smaller conversations, like you mentioned, and you're on your couch with your friends and then go from there, and your nonprofit. I would rather have opportunities for looking at the project or the issue or whatever we're focusing our attention on at this town hall and breaking up into small groups and finding solutions that are generated from the community members themselves, workshopping. I am a big fan that we are experts of our place. We know it. We have the opportunity to, with a little help even, to translate our language into city planning language. We can really make strong change, and I would rather have more opportunities for us to work together on that than have a city member tell me what the project is about without opportunities for collaboration.
And I would just like to second that with the historical perspective and the archive. So there was 400 town hall meetings that were, in the archives that I probably went through some of them, but not all of them. And even with all that, there was 9 lawsuits. Annexation took 10 years because people were not on board, and with contentious issues and multiple narratives happening historically during that time, it would have been great for somebody like Joy to be around, right? To come and do her workshop, because when you have a contentious issue that people can't decide on, a town hall necessarily is not it's a power struggle. And so you need to figure out how to address it in a way that actually is going to bring community together. And the situation and how the city dealt with annexation through these records, it just showed me kind of when I went in and called up the neighborhood association and I said, "Oh, hi, I'm Sabina Haque. I'm the artist in residence for the city archives, and I'm doing a project about East Portland. I'd love to come and meet you." And she's like, "Who the hell are you, and why have you been selected to make art about us?" right? And this is 2016, 35 years later. So there's still that energy left from how things went down. And it's not about what happened, it's about how they happened that's more important. And that's what I think is really important, that we're talking about how we can do things differently, you know, to create that kind of change in the community.
I know you had another question about 82nd and slavery, yes.
Hi.
Oh, wait.
Oh,
no, he's still there. I
He's
can
still here. There was a second part to his question. Did you want to address that about?
Yeah, I mentioned.
Yeah.
I mentioned the auction block that takes place on 82nd Avenue with the slave trade that's going on there, and also the ability for houseless that are trying so hard to figure out how to fit into communities. How can we get out of the way for those solutions to be heard?
I guess I'll start. So I think that some of this, I think I talked a little bit, but I think some of this is about prioritization of what is happening in the city or the world around us. And I think we really need to prioritize. Like, again, is it more important for me to be able to like park my car in front of my house, or is it more important for me to, you know, contribute or know that we're trying to address the sex slave issue and people, you know, picking up teenage girls up and down, you know, I-5 corridor, basically. So I think first of all, we all have to prioritize what is the most important issue, or not the most, but what are the different competing issues. And some issues really, I have to say from a justice perspective, might not be as important as others. So first, you know, I think that that's one thing that we have to do. And then the funding comes from that, you know, then we prioritize the funding in that, in there too. And then we think about things like in terms of homelessness, we think about, you know, while we're trying to get money to build more affordable housing, we need to think about where people currently are sleeping. And, you know, should they be allowed to sleep in a park? Should they be allowed to sleep on a sidewalk? You know, what is public space? Is public space for all of us to occupy? Do we all have a right to public space and to sleep or do what we need to do? So these are, I know I'm being philosophical, but these are really important questions because it underlies everything in the way that we behave and then we think about things and then our actions. The question, I don't know if I'm answering it. I mean, I guess, am I answering it?
That's a hard question.
If you ask more specifically, I can maybe answer it more, or someone else can.
I think from your perspective, that's a good start of a conversation. But I also recognize when you're saying that the people who are involved in those life choices can't wait for those priorities to be elevated.
Yeah, they're super urgent. That's why each one of us has to do something about it. But we have to look at how we are prioritizing things ourselves to be able to assist these people. It takes all of us to address these issues. And for us to have a hierarchy of like, you know, like we have to make sure people are fed, that, you know, a teenager, a teen girl is actually allowed to have a childhood.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. Sorry. Hi, Joy.
Hello there.
I have been a planner for 32 years. Was involved pretty deeply in the Alberta Street efforts, and I've lived in inner Northeast Portland since 1973. And looking at the things that conditions that have created the opportunities for gentrification are usually the disinterest and the willful disregard of the politicians, and you know, leading to disinvestment in communities, and then the sort of crisis that emanates from that. And we see that with in the east of 82nd when it was the sewer, you know, the Multnomah County not being able to provide services. And we're in a time now where there is so much grassroots will to do things. And so, you know, you are all really lucky right now in terms of that the motivation for people to be involved is there. But the one thing that is still missing is the political will and the funding that comes from that. And that's where the focus never seems to get to quite when we're doing, you know, grassroots organizing and putting that larger lens on where the money is going to come from to do this work. And so I'd like to know, you know, as you're doing each of you doing your work, how are you funneling that message up to where it needs to go to get that funding?
That's a good question.
I guess my first response in that is that is also a leadership development pipeline, I think, issue as well. Like, how do we develop leadership so that folks who traditionally aren't in those positions of power to be able to make those decisions have the capacity to do so. And that's kind of the long game, I guess, in thinking about how do we kind of make shifts within the political structure, because it is, you know, a slow moving boat in a lot of ways. And it takes a lot of time to kind of shift these large institutions. But I think focusing on that leadership development piece is critical. And within like our placemaking program, for instance, this year, we have folks involved age 16 to, you know, like 65. So really thinking deeply about who we're involving in our work too, and who are prioritizing in our work is something that we're really focusing on at Apano. And yeah, developing youth leadership is a huge, huge part of what we do.
And you are directly right now in a capital campaign. How much have you raised so far, and how much are you planning to raise for the community building, which has, I think, 5,000 or 6,000 square feet of, including affordable housing? Where are you guys at?
So we're fundraising for that bottom floor piece, and it's going to be about 2.3 million that we're raising, and we're about a little under halfway there.
And you just started this year, right?
Yes, we just started in February.
Yeah, so I think that, and the thing is that most of their donors are your average donors, like under $100, right?
$25.
$25 is their average donor. Like artists like myself are giving back, little people who can, anything that they can afford. And I think that when there is a good idea on the table, I think people are going to fund it. But that's where I think the rubber meets the road, as my mother says. We have to find ways to fund it, and fund it without losing ourselves too, right? And that's the tricky part, right? Who are we in bed with, and how do we make sure that they're on the right side of equity, and they're on the right side of what we want to do? And there's a lot of developers who will be like, oh yeah, we love artists, or yeah, we love NGOs, but really it's about their bottom line, and trying to sort of educate them as well, I think, in this process is also part of it, part of the discussion that needs to happen.
I would say too, we need more public, I guess, financial, social justice advocates. I'm in constant awe of Meyer's chief investment officer, Rakaya Adams, and she constantly talks about how she's using her power and privilege as being a native Portland, growing up, I believe, in the Lloyd District, and watching that neighborhood completely change, and how she uses her background in investing and being on all these committees for budgets and actually helping to make sure these projects are actually equitable. I'm not a numbers person, and I at times really wish I would be, because there's so much power there as well. And I think that goes back to what Leslie was saying about knowing your role. When I think of an accountant or someone who's on a certain budgetary committee, a lot of the people may not think of that as a social justice advocate, but we need people there as well. We need advocates who are strong and thinking about a holistic program and not just going the easy route with a certain developer, and actually investing in some CDCs who can do the work, I would say probably better and a little bit more affordable, and that has a longer impact. But I'm a big fan of supporting people like Rakaya Adams, who are constantly sitting on committees for the city and for the state to push for racial equity and social justice as a whole.
And to second that, I don't know if you guys know about, it used to be, what is it called? Oregon, what is Casey Jama's organization called now? Unite Oregon. So they started out as a social justice organization, and they started training people of color to be leaders and to really develop that. And there's a couple of different organizations that help do that. And I think there's even been more emphasis now in our current democratic situation to really push that and to really get that capital out there, because we are a product of our communities and our parents and the resources, but most people don't have access. In fact, David Douglas School District is one of the most crowded school districts in the state of Oregon right now. They don't have resources. 40% of our youth, all children under the age of 18, are growing up east of 82nd. They don't have access to parks as much as other libraries. Everything is reduced access, and it's even more dangerous to walk on those streets. So how are we figuring out how to train this community that's coming out of our schools? We really need to focus in our nonprofits to really provide the leaders of the future.
Mm-hmm. So I have one more thought. I think also, especially working a lot with nonprofits and social justice organizations, we are constantly fighting against each other for the same resources. And it's sad, and it's like that idea of prioritizing. It feels like at times we are, we're competing with each other to say that our neighborhood needs these resources and this project deserves to be pushed over another. And I would love to see in the next few years, especially as we grow, that we start working together a little bit more, and that we demand more resources, and that we, like I mentioned, sit on those budget committees and actually demand that it's equitably distributed, because we can't continue to fight for these small resources and expect larger results as we grow. It's just not possible.
So as a city representative, I feel like I should try to answer your question, but I don't think I have anything else to say, actually, because like I have no line to anybody, to the commissioners. I don't have even the director. I don't really see of our bureau. So, what I can do is, again, when I work with the public, the residents in North Portland, I can give them the resources they need and tell them about, how to strategize in order to communicate with the powers that be to get their needs met, basically. But I think, what everybody here has been saying is really core in terms of, we need officials, we need city commissioners, we need, everyone. We need people who are representative of our community, who have similar values. We need people sitting on the different boards and commissions, whether it be, the budget commission or whatever of different departments, to also be reflective of the community.
We need to raise money. We need to have artists. We need to have all that stuff. All that
we need
good
to
stuff.
redistribute wealth. There's a lot of things
So much
to do.
We're very busy. Very busy.
That's what keeps us up at night.
Any other questions? We have about 5 more minutes.
You all talked so much about elevating voices, and there are so many things. I just think about so many issues, like we have so many new Portlanders who all have different traditions about engaging or not engaging in these kinds of conversations about making community. And like in the video, there was the dad who worked 2 full-time jobs, different generations. So like thinking about Bonnie McKnight and then thinking about the high schoolers, just this big mix of people that might make it hard to elevate the voices like you were talking about. But despite that, it feels like there's coming together, like in the capital campaign, the $25 contributions. Can you share some just experiences or observations where there's been just great moments of engagement in unexpected ways?
I mean, from a capital kind of, I guess, the bigger narrative behind some of the capital campaign story is it's been really powerful to see people come together around this project in ways that I didn't necessarily expect. The most tangible example is that we were running kind of an Indiegogo kind of crowdsourcing component of this campaign. And we gave ourselves like a month and a half to raise about $25,000. And we're like, okay, like that seems reasonable. And about 2 weeks in, Indiegogo told us that they were actually going to be forcibly ending our campaign in about 4 days from that time. Because of a switchover in their payment processor on the back end. And we had raised about $9,000 at that point. And so we were like, okay, we're going to try to make our $25,000 goal in the next 4 days. And it was incredible. There was a lot of social media happening. There was a lot of calling people, telling everyone I knew about this particular project. But that momentum of people really coming together and really demonstrating their care for this idea and for this vision, right, was just, it kind of blew my mind, and that we were able to do that in such a short period of time. And people, it didn't matter really what the amount was in a lot of ways, what people gave, but I think just this idea of everyone is pitching in as much as they could. For this particular project was just incredibly inspiring, and yeah, it fills my heart with joy in a lot of ways. Just to see that grassroots model really work, Mm-hmm. So to get out of some of the nonprofit industrial, everything has to be grant funded and fought for at a mm-hmm. policy level or at a larger institutional funding level.
I think to answer your question, as an artist, I've often been drawn to stories that have been underdocumented or forgotten. And in a sense, when I found this, I was like, oh my God, this is really interesting. And nobody knows about it. In fact, the director of the Jade, I was like, do you know about this? Do you know that 56,000 households didn't have sewers? And he's like, I don't know any of this. And so what was interesting is through the process of the research and the process of making the film, and then when I exhibited it, all of a sudden this huge community came together, and their responses were like, we never knew this. And then there was people that had lived through it that were like, thank goodness you are putting this out there. We want this history to be archived. We want it to be collected. We want it to be known. And then I toured 60 students from Madison High School, and they came in, and I was like, they're going to be disinterested, and, and they focused, they listened, but then I was like, I don't know what they got from it, and I got 60 letters from all of them. Maybe their teacher told them to do it, but they were all really, there wasn't one that was like, oh yeah, it was interesting question. They were all like, I wish I had brought them, but there was, I never knew this about this, now I'm really engaged in this. So that made me kind of think about how I need to really work with communities that may never have known about this, So that was the biggest thing that I got, is like, I never knew this. This is so important. This kind of, it gives me an understanding of why things they are the way they are in this area. And I think gives you a way to sort of figure out how to steer the boat in the next direction. How can we do it differently? Because we know our past. If you don't know your past, you're doomed to repeat it.
Do you guys have any final thoughts before we close the panel down?
Don't be apathetic. Go out there, activate. Yeah.
We look forward to having more conversations like this in the future. Sabina and I have talked about it, so please stay tuned for what's to come. But thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thank you to our panel for speaking so well about all these issues. Thank you, guys.